Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 13 of my game design series of videos. In this video I'll be providing a brief overview of Ancient's skirmish scale rules. When I discovered that there were actual ancient skirmish rules, I must admit being rather surprised. However, after some thought, I realised it was inevitable. Anyone who have played fantasy role-playing would fit right into ancient skirmish rules. Thus, there is a large body of potential new players. When there's a market, someone will work out how to satisfy that market. As with my other videos in other periods, these videos, Ancient, break down historical period into a scale. In this case, it's skirmish scale. Skirmish scale means each infantry figure represents one person, and a player would typically field 12 to 24 figures per side. In the Ancients area, normally each figure could actually even represent more than one person, but the basic principle of skirmish is one figure, one man. I'm not going to make any attempt to analyse the game systems or history, and as my expertise in this area is minimal. Instead, I'll simply list all the rules that I am aware of. Rick Priestley is a world-renowned game designer, having created Game Workshop, Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 game systems, among others. Following on from this highly acclaimed horse and musket rules, Black Powder, he has now turned his attention to the ancient world with Hail Caesar, which spans from 3000 BC through to about 1100 AD. Hail Caesar provides an extremely entertaining game with more than enough period flavour, especially if additional rules such as Parthian shot or wild fighters are utilised. Units represent tactical units of the ancient era, such as warbands or cohorts. Each unit is classified as tiny, small, standard or large. For example, a standard German warband is made up of 32 to 36 figures in a double rank of stands, while an Imperial Roman cohort contains 16 to 18 figures in a single rank of stands. Unit frontages are defined, but actual numbers of figures can be scaled up or down per stand. I typically use 5 to 6 figures per stand. Each unit also has detailed characteristics covering combat values for clash, that is the first combat round, and sustained action, short or long range missile attack ratings, morale based on training and army, which is reflected through saving throws, and stamina, which is reflected by the number of hits a unit can sustain before becoming shaken. Any additional rules are added to enhance historical flavour. For example, Roman heavy infantry can use the pilum rule, or a barbarian warband can be categorised as wild fighters, each characteristics having an effect on gameplay. Of Gods and Mortals is a scalable skirmish rule set where the average scenario plays in about 1 hour using up to 20 models per player on a 4x4 foot table. Each player contains or controls one god, 1 to 3 legends such as priests, demigods, heroes, monsters or other mythical creatures, and 10 to 20 men, typically infantry, cavalry and the occasional artillery piece. This creates a 3-tiered structure in the warband. The 3 troop types are independent or interdependent in more than one way. Gods lead men by their powers, while at the same time men give powers to the gods by their faith in them. A god cannot exist without its faithful. The faithful cannot win without the help of their god. There is no automatic winning strategy. The player must balance his limited resources and outguesses his opponent. A bit of luck obviously helps as well. Broken Legions is a warband style of skirmish game, so players will each need a warband of between 7 and 12 models aside. Since the game is set in a mythical ancient Roman timeline, warband consists of miniatures from the armies of the time: Imperial Rome, gladiators, barbarians, Dacians, Parthians, Argonauts, such as Greeks, and the cult of Set, Egyptians. However, since this is a fantasy game as well, other models will be needed. For example, you can recruit mummies, werewolves, Amazons, Lamnia, Cyclops, necromancers, or even a demigod into your warband. In addition, one of the scenarios uses wandering monsters, so if possible you will need models to represent a Chimera, Gorgon, Harpies, Hydra and Minotaur. The game is normally played on a 3x3 foot board, ideally with a good smattering of scenery. Turns of SPQR begin with both players rolling the dice of fate. Compare the scores and whoever has rolled the highest will choose whether they go first or second. This will allow you to seize the initiative or sit back and let the enemy spring your trap. On your turn, your units will each be able to take up to 2 actions: moving, shooting, melee and special actions. You can take 2 of the same action or mix and match to fit the situation at hand. SPQR uses checks to determine the outcome of any given action. Simply roll a 6-sided dice and add the bonus provided by your unit stats. Any result of a 6 or higher is a success. A melee action allows you to perform a normal move action. If you end up in base-to-base contact with the enemy, you can put his troops to the sword. Every model in the attacking unit must attempt to get as close as possible to the enemy, as much as their movement allows. Both sides make simultaneous melee checks, adding their melee score to the result. As always, every result of 6 or higher is a success and will cause a wound to the enemy unit. This is where skilled fighters, larger units and armour come into their own. If both units are still standing and in contact with each other at the end of the melee action, they are locked in close, deadly combat. Men of Bronze is a wargame which allows you to play out classical Greek hoplite battles on the playing or tabletop. Players are strategos, generals, leading phalanxes of bronze-clad warriors in pursuit of fame, glory and the honour of their city-state. To win such prizes, however, you must prove your mettle, display your valour and bring the other strategos to their knees. Designed to recreate small battles or larger skirmishes with 50 to 80 figures per side, each army will have its own unique mix of rules, advantages, backgrounds and abilities. Strategos must understand and appreciate the strengths and weaknesses of their forces in order to win glory on the battlefield. Saga Age of Hannibal is a rather well-produced set of ancient figure gaming skirmish rules, focused on the period around Hannibal and designed to refight rather abstract battles. It heavily uses cards and battle boards. The rules look very nice and are filled with a lot of bling. While I have the rules, I have not studied them in any great detail, and this looks like a set of rules designed for very few 28mm figures per side and represents a high abstract experience, or abstracted experience. Clash of Spears is a set of miniatures wargame rules intended for skirmishes of roughly 30 to 60 men per side in the last few centuries before the birth of Christ. Troop definitions are provided for Romans, Carthaginians, Greeks, Gauls, Iberians, Italians and Macedonians, but the rules are intended to have wider applicability and the rules provide design rules to create your own troop profiles. The game aids to provide a solid tactical combat system to represent raids, scouting and many other types of small actions. The armies are made up of line troops gathered in groups of 6 to 10 figures and a few characters which direct the action. Works with 28 or 15mm figures, individually based figures are preferred, specific basing is not required. The system is based on resource management. You have to manage the characters' command points to activate the units, but more importantly you have to manage the fatigue on your units for them to be combat effective. Combat mechanics are based on D6, always rolling higher is always good. The rulebook includes pick-up game scenarios and 2 flexible formats to build armies. Infamy is a true skirmish game for the late Republic, early Imperial Roman period. True skirmish as it's trying to simulate skirmish warfare instead of being a mass battle game in 28mm. Think raiding, barbarian ambushes, burning huts, scouting, etc. Pretty steep learning curve, but some really flavourable asymmetric mechanics are available in the rules. This is a skirmish game designed for 50 to 70 28mm figures as a baseline. But unlike a lot of games that try and hit this point, it genuinely is really genuinely a skirmish game. It's not trying to invent some scaled down version of mass battles. It's doing its own very specific thing. It doesn't fall in the trap of pretending that a skirmish rule set is going to replicate the large formations of famous battles. Might and Melee is a standalone book. Players familiar with Fistful of Lead will find the core mechanics the same. What we've added is flavour for the genre. This rulebook can be used by itself for skirmish between knightly retinues or barbarian warlords, but is also the first book of 3 for using Fistful of Lead in a larger fantasy setting. The second book introduces magic, while the third brings in mythical monsters and the underground world they often inhabit. When using the term medieval, we're using the term medieval in a very broad sense. You should be able to use these rules for anything from a Viking raid to a skirmish between Yorkshires and Lancashirians. Covers Dark Ages, Middle Ages and the War of the Roses. You could also use these rules with a few tweaks for non-European combats, like between samurai. Might and Melee doesn't focus on huge battles. Instead, it's focusing on individuals. A knight could go his whole life and never see a battle, but he would see numerous skirmishes against robber knights, old enemies and bandits, not to mention the occasional marauding dragon. Fistful of Lead, Might and Melee, is not a faithful historical recreation of medieval combat, but rather a Hollywood version of it. I'm not going to drill down into the game mechanics concerning these rules to any great extent, except that most of these rules aren't exactly the one man equals one figure scale. It's more of a warband type of skirmish sets of rules. This does make a lot of sense for this period. The one interesting point is how this scale has exploded in the last 10 years with a surprising number of rules coming out and being published. Some of the skirmish rules have a figure scale similar to non-skirmish rules, which I find a little bit surprising. However, the key point is that you do not feel too many elements on the playing area using these rules, which is what makes them different from, let's say, the old WRG 5th edition rules, which may use a similar element scale to some of the skirmish rules. And so this concludes episode 13 of my video on game system design, which in this case provides an overview of ancient skirmish scale figure gaming rules. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.